So this is the first of two videos I'm going to do pertaining to my Outlaw Rampage Pro. This is the purple Dirt Alliance Heatwave Chevy, and this is what I've done to maximize suspension travel, and when we get to the rear, what I've done to make it fit the 12.3-inch wheelbase body. So at the front on these trucks, if you have one, you know it comes with this little plastic spacer on the front shocks, keeping it from traveling up all the way. So to get more travel, that spacer is about 5 millimeters thick. So I remove the 5 millimeter spacer, and rather than getting 5 millimeters of up travel, which you start to run into problems with tires hitting the body, etc., I replace this lower rod end with the stock one being about 13 millimeters plus that 5 mil spacer. I put on an 18 to 19 millimeter rod end so that I can make up that 5 millimeters of travel in down travel. What becomes an issue with that extra down travel is the upper control arm will actually hit and sit on top of the steering slider and the steering rack. So what I've done, and I haven't had any strength issues with it set up this way so far, is I just follow the lines in it here and just Dremel away this portion so that when it goes to full droop, it's now actually sitting flush next to the actual steering rack. The stock steering rod ends don't have enough misalignment, and even these aftermarket ones from RC 4-wheel drive, SSD, wherever you get yours, they're going to max out. Even with the stock suspension, it doesn't really allow it to get full droop, and you'll notice the ball cups on them are flexing when you try and droop it down all the way. So what I've done to remedy that is I put these metal, I think they're from a set of Injora shocks. They're metal rod ends. They don't have much travel as far as misalignment goes. They're really stiff, not very good for shocks. So I take them and screw them to the knuckle, and as long as you keep them tight and get them really tight, they don't want to twist as you steer. To help with the twisting, I've put 4 millimeter ID washers and then a regular 3 millimeter ID washer on it to keep that ball end from spinning inside the rod end. Then I just replace the outer with a standard rod end, and I like to use the ones that are smooth all the way down on both sides without the little washer type piece on the end, just because they don't bind up as quickly. And this allows to rotate that rod end from having a vertical bolt position going down through it to a horizontal bolt position where you're actually rotating around the ball in the rod end, as opposed to trying to max out that misalignment side to side. In doing this, it also raises the outer tie rod a little bit, which I've found helps with getting bump steer out pretty nicely. The original tie rod center line from the knuckle to the center of where it mounts is about 4 millimeters. Now with this setup, the center line of this outer tie rod end sits at about 11 millimeters. So you're raising it about 7 millimeter, which really helps. And it's still, I've got a tiny bit of bump steer, but also a lot of that has to do with the play that is in the suspension. I haven't gotten around to sleeving these with 3/16 brake line to get out all the slop. Then once you've got this kind of setup, I'm running right now an eye-to-eye length on the tie rods of about 48, 49 millimeters, somewhere right in between there, 48 and a half. And that seems to be working good. I may shorten them just a tiny bit because I'm noticing a hair of toe out at full droop and at full bump. And so that usually means that your tie rod end is just a little bit long to keep that alignment straight. If we look down in the center here, and I've taken the servo brace off, it's kind of hard to see, but as far as the center section on this, it's all basic, just basic servo horn and the stock setup. Nothing's been changed with that. just the extra clearance to the upper arm, because I had tried filing the stops off the stock steering rack, but that didn't give me enough droop. So basically that's what you're working with up front. Now out back, because I changed to the Chevy body, and I believe the stock Outlaw Rampage wheelbase is about 13 inches or so, and the body I'm running is for a 12.3 wheelbase setup. So what I've done in the rear is used their basically SSD knockoff trailing arms, and I've used these to shorten the rear wheelbase because the front end lined up pretty good. So I figured I'd do my shortening in the rear. You could go a little bit longer with these. The wheel sits a tiny bit forward in the wheel well, and if I wanted to perfect it, I'd probably space it out just a hair. But what you're looking for, and when you change to these, because the Outlaw Rampage has these offset angled upper mounts for the rear trailing arm, you're going to want to switch to an angled rod end on that. I'm using just some generic angled rod end on the front, and I think some kind of Traxxas rod end on the rear, shooting for an eye-to-eye length on these of about 142 millimeters. Like I said, you could go a little longer, 143, 145 if you wanted to. And then in the rear, I basically have just dropped the factory shock down into this lower mounting hole here, and that keeps, when you're on full compression, it'll keep the axle from bottoming out under the frame better than I found the stock setup did. And with my fuel cell weight box mounted up here, it gave me that extra clearance from it hitting that as well. Then in the stock upper hole here, I'm running 125 millimeter eye-to-eye shock as a bypass. And with that setup like that, it seems to work pretty perfectly. I'm happy with it. The main shock spring is all stock still. I haven't changed any of that. To match the lower, and you could go lower than I did, I kind of left them a little longer than was probably perfect, but I wanted that lower skid to angle up in the front a bit more so it doesn't hang up on things as much. With the uppers, all I did was swapped these rod ends on the axle side to a much shorter angled rod end. I think they come with Red Cat something, but they're basically just a really short angled rod end. If you don't have one that short, you could switch the long uppers and the long lowers for a slightly shorter unit on both ends. And with those, I got about 83 millimeters eye to eye, and that seems to work good for what I wanted out of it. You could lay the skid plate a little more flat and shorten both ends a little more than that. That's kind of up to you, but that's basically it on this guy. Right now I'm cycling at the axle pin about 2¼ inches vertical travel in the front and just about 3 inches vertical travel in the rear, which I can't remember what the stock numbers are, but it's a good increase in travel on both ends. I'm very happy with it.